Welcome to a space where logic dissolves and thought folds in on itself. Here, paradox isn't a problem, it's a doorway, a soft unraveling of the stories we tell ourselves about time, reality, and who we think we are. In this hour-long journey, you'll encounter 20 paradoxes crafted to twist the mind and blur the line between sense and silence. Some will question memory, others will tangle your perception of space, thought, and identity. But none of them demand answers. Instead, they invite you to drift, mentally, emotionally, even spiritually, into the unknown. Let each paradox unsettle you gently, like a dream you can't quite remember, but can never forget. Whether you're here to sleep or simply to explore, this is your permission to let go, to surrender the need for resolution. Because sometimes, in not knowing, we get closer to truth than we ever expected. Close your eyes and recall a moment, maybe from childhood or last week or a dream. You can see it, feel it, almost relive it. But here's the catch. What if that memory never happened? What if the moment your mind is replaying is nothing more than a fabrication? Not a lie you told yourself, but something that genuinely feels true, and yet never was. This is the paradox of remembering what never happened. A contradiction that lurks not in external reality, but in the very structure of your mind. You might think of memory as a camera, something that passively records events for later playback. But neuroscience tells a different story. Memory is reconstructive. Each time you remember, you don't access a file. You rebuild the event from scratch. And in that rebuilding, your brain fills in blanks, alters timelines, and adds or subtracts details without your permission. Sometimes this is minor, a name forgotten, a color misremembered. But other times, it's entire events, conversations you swear took place, relationships you remember one way while someone else remembers differently, even memories that feel rooted in reality, but have no evidence to support them. Then there's the Mandela effect, the collective misremembering of events. Entire groups of people recall something that never occurred, a logo that was never designed the way they remember, a phrase in a movie that was never spoken, a public figure's death that never actually happened, and it feels real. Not just like an error, but like a wrong version of the world is trying to overwrite the right one. So which memory is correct? And if memory is unreliable, what happens to your sense of identity, built as it is on the scaffolding of the past? Who are you if your memories are illusions? Even more disturbing is the idea that false memories aren't just glitches. They may be essential. Your brain, in order to function, must make assumptions and predictions. It must compress information, simplify, and discard. In doing so, it creates a narrative, and sometimes that narrative is more useful than the truth. That means some of your most cherished moments may not be accurate. Some of your regrets may be based on things that never truly happened. Your entire story, your sense of continuity, may be stitched together from fiction wrapped in emotional truth. But the paradox cuts deeper still, because even if a memory is false, if it changes you, if it shapes who you are, if it feels real, does it matter whether it happened or not? A memory can be false and still define your choices. A dream can be more influential than a real event. And if that's true, then perhaps what matters isn't whether something happened, but whether it's believed. Now pause and reflect. How many of your decisions, beliefs, and emotions are based on memories that might not be entirely real? How much of your identity is an echo of things that never occurred? And if your past is flexible, if it can be rewritten without your knowing, how solid is your present? This paradox doesn't want to scare you. It wants to unsettle the false certainty we carry about memory and time, It invites you to loosen your grip on the idea that your life is a fixed narrative, locked in place behind you. Maybe it never was. Maybe you are not a story being told, but a moment being retold again and again, shaped by the remembering itself. You are the memory of something that never fully happened, and yet here you are. Picture a figure standing in the sunlight. Behind them stretches a shadow, silent, shapeless, and ever-present. It moves when they move, stretches when they stretch, and disappears in darkness. Now, imagine this. What if the shadow begins to think? What if it believes it's the one doing the moving? What if it thinks you are following it? This is the paradox of the shadow that thinks. A quiet, haunting idea that what you perceive as you might not be the origin of thought, but its reflection. We often assume that thoughts originate from the self, that there is a solid I behind the mind, issuing commands, making decisions, forming ideas. But the more you observe your own thoughts, the more slippery that I becomes. Where is it located? Can you find it, isolate it, observe it independently of the thoughts it claims to control? You might try sitting in silence, watching your mind. Thoughts arise, images appear, feelings bloom and vanish. But do you generate them, or do they simply happen? And then a split second later, the mind says, I thought that. The self, in this light, begins to resemble a shadow, an echo that follows thought, claiming it as its own, not the source of thinking, but the narrator of what has already occurred. Neuroscience supports this eerie notion. Studies have shown that decisions often register in the brain before we become consciously aware of them. The thought appears, and only afterward does the conscious self take ownership. The illusion is seamless, but the timeline is backward. So what does that make you? If you are not the one who chooses the thought, but the one who watches and identifies with it, are you the thinker at all, or just the witness? Here lies the paradox. The mind believes itself to be the origin of its own process, even though that belief may itself be a byproduct of that very process. The shadow thinks it casts itself. It's like a reflection in a mirror that becomes convinced it's the original, a puppet that believes it's pulling its own strings. And this illusion is persistent. We structure our entire identity around it. I decided, I chose, I created. But the truth might be far stranger, that you are not the doer, but the afterthought. Not the command center, but the commentary. This doesn't mean you don't exist, but it raises the question, what are you, if not the thinker of thoughts? Some philosophies, especially in Eastern traditions, speak of a deeper awareness, a silent observer behind even the narrator. Not the voice in the head, but the one who hears it. Not the shadow, not the body, not the thought, but the presence, in which all of them occur. But this presence has no shape, no boundary. It cannot be seen, only known through its own witnessing. And it never speaks for itself, because it doesn't need to. Perhaps the thinking mind is like a shadow cast by light passing through form. And perhaps the paradox is not that the shadow thinks, but that it forgets it is a shadow at all. What changes when you realize this? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. When the shadow stops believing it leads the body, it begins to fall effortlessly behind it. Thought becomes lighter. Identity becomes softer. And the silence behind it all grows louder. You may never fully separate from the shadow, but you can learn to see it for what it is, a beautiful, temporary reflection of something deeper, a thinking echo, a whisper in the light. And maybe, just maybe, the real you is not the voice in your head, but the silence that hears it. Imagine waking up one day to discover that the end of the universe loops back to its beginning, not metaphorically, but literally. That the Big Bang and the final collapse, the birth and the death of everything, are not two events, but the same event, seen from different points on a closed, infinite loop. This is the paradox of the self-looping universe, a reality where time does not stretch like a straight arrow, but bends like a circle until past and future dissolve into one endless repetition. At first it seems absurd. We feel time as a one-way street. We're born, we live, we die. Galaxies expand, stars explode, entropy increases. But physics has no rule that demands time must flow in one direction. The laws of motion, quantum fields, and relativity work just as well in reverse. The arrow of time, the sensation that the future is ahead and the past is behind, is something we impose. It's psychological, not physical. But what if the structure of the universe reflects a far deeper cycle? Some cosmologists have proposed that the universe is cyclic, expanding, contracting, then beginning again in a cosmic breath that has no true beginning or end. In this view, the Big Bang wasn't a singular starting point, but the reboot of a previous universe collapsing in on itself. Even stranger is the idea that the laws of physics might be tuned in such a way that every cycle, every loop, plays out in precisely the same way. You live this life, you die, the universe restarts, and then you live it again, exactly the same, without knowing. Over and over and over, eternal recurrence. Not a poetic idea, but a physical model. Now pause. If that were true, if this moment, right now, has happened an infinite number of times before and will happen an infinite number of times again, what does that do to your sense of free will? If everything is looping, then your choices are not just predetermined. They're locked into an eternal track. Your sense of agency, your feeling of decision-making, becomes an echo inside a system that repeats forever. And yet, you still feel it. The choice, the presence, the now. So which is it? Are you the rider or the track? The paradox deepens when you ask, could the universe be structured in such a way that it needs to repeat? That the very conditions for existence require a cyclical collapse and rebirth? Some theoretical models even suggest that the information from one universe could be imprinted into the next. A cosmic memory. Not a duplicate, but a resonance. A shadow of every universe before, stitched into the fabric of every universe to come. This turns the paradox inward. What if your deepest intuitions about time, about self, about déjà vu, aren't just psychological glitches, but faint echoes from a reality you've already lived, again and again? You've been here before, and you will be again. But here's the twist. Even if it's true, you won't remember. The loop erases its own beginning as it completes itself. Each time around feels like the first. So does it matter? That's the true puzzle. If you are doomed to live this exact life on an infinite loop, does that make it meaningless or profoundly meaningful? Does eternity diminish the moment or elevate it? Maybe the point of the loop is not to escape it. Maybe the point is to notice it, to realize that within the cycle, there is still beauty, still mystery, still choice, or at least the feeling of it. And maybe that feeling is enough. Picture a door, solid, real, with a handle waiting to be turned. But when you open it, there's nothing. Not a room, not a hallway, not even a void. Just a sense of having opened something to nowhere. And yet, the act of opening it feels meaningful. Necessary even. Why? This is the paradox of the door that opens nowhere, an image that echoes through consciousness, psychology, and the very way we seek meaning. It represents our endless impulse to seek, to open, to explore, even when there's nothing on the other side. We spend our lives walking through doors, decisions, transitions, beliefs. We chase knowledge, revelation, connection, always imagining that what's on the other side will complete something, that the door itself is a portal to fulfillment, truth, or clarity. But what if some doors were never meant to lead anywhere? What if some openings are simply there? This paradox lives at the heart of human experience. We create meaning out of nothing. We seek purpose in randomness. We stare into the unknown and assign it names, beliefs, explanations. But what if some mysteries have no resolution? What if some truths can be questioned forever without ever being answered? The danger isn't in opening the door, it's in thinking there must be something behind it. In psychology, this shows up as the search for closure, a drive so strong that the mind will invent answers just to satisfy itself. We'd rather believe a lie than live in ambiguity, but some doors, some questions, aren't meant to be closed. They exist not to resolve, but to expand. Think of a person who spends their life chasing a final answer, a single belief, a single revelation, a moment when everything makes sense. But when they finally arrive, they realize it's just another door, another layer, and the more doors they open, the more they realize there's no destination, only the act of opening itself. This is mirrored in spiritual traditions. Zen Buddhism teaches that enlightenment isn't a final state. It's a realization that there's no gate to pass through and no other side. The koan, a riddle meant to defy logic, is itself a door that leads nowhere. And that's the point. It reveals the futility of trying to solve existence like a puzzle. But that doesn't make the door meaningless. In fact, its emptiness is the lesson. To open a door expecting something specific is to be bound by expectation. But to open a door, knowing there might be nothing, and still open it, that is something else entirely. That is freedom. The paradox invites you to reframe how you live. What if you stopped expecting the next answer to be the one that finally fulfills you? What if you stepped through doors without demanding a reward? What if curiosity was enough? We are perhaps not meant to arrive. We are meant to move. And the act of reaching, of seeking, of turning the handle, even knowing there might be nothing, is a profoundly human thing. It's how we stay alive. It's how we remain open. So the next time you face a question you can't answer, a moment that makes no sense, a silence that feels too loud, don't panic. Don't force a meaning. Just open the door and stand there, in the stillness, knowing it goes nowhere, and yet you opened it. There's something oddly comforting about saying, I know. It brings order to the chaos. It closes the loop. It draws a line around the unknown and declares, this is now understood. But what if that feeling, the certainty that you know, something is itself an illusion? What if knowing is a mask the mind wears to feel safe in a world that was never meant to be solved? This is the paradox of the illusion of knowing, where the closer we believe we are to truth, the more likely it is we've simply stopped asking the right questions. We're taught to equate knowledge with progress. The more you know, the more you control. The more you control, the safer you are. But true knowledge isn't just about information, it's about how you hold it. And the mind, brilliant as it is, has a tendency to confuse familiarity with understanding. Repeat something often enough, and it becomes a fact, regardless of whether it's been examined or earned. Take language, for example. You know what a chair is. You can point to it, sit on it, recognize it. But what happens when you try to define it precisely? Is a stool a chair? Is a beanbag? What about a rock you sit on? The more you try to pin it down, the blurrier the concept becomes. You know it until you don't. The paradox appears in science too. Quantum mechanics is built on mathematics we trust, but interpretations we barely grasp. Entire fields operate on models that work, but don't fully make sense. We launch rockets, cure diseases, build AI, all while knowing that the foundation of reality is still, ultimately, a mystery. But perhaps nowhere is the illusion of knowing more dangerous than in the self. You say, I know who I am, but who is that exactly? A name, a set of memories, a collection of preferences, beliefs, and emotions. Are you the same person you were 5 years ago? 10? If everything about you can change, your body, your thoughts, your opinions, then what remains? What do you truly know about yourself? The self is a story the brain tells to give shape to experience, but like all good stories, it adapts, it shifts, it edits itself constantly, and yet we cling to it as though it's a solid fact, not a fluid narrative. This paradox doesn't ask you to throw away knowledge. It asks you to hold it differently, to question what it means to know something, and to recognize how often we stop asking questions the moment something feels familiar. We trade depth for certainty. We choose simplicity over truth. But real wisdom lives in the space beyond answers. It lives in the humility of not knowing, in the ability to sit with ambiguity, to recognize that mystery is not a failure of knowledge, it's its frontier. Think of how many wars, arguments, divisions arise from people who are absolutely sure they're right. Certainty becomes a weapon, doubt, a weakness. But what if the most dangerous people are not the ones who don't know, but the ones who think they do? There's a freedom in admitting, I don't know. It creates room. It softens the mind. It invites learning instead of defending. And it allows something strange to happen. The world becomes alive again, because when you stop pretending to know, you begin to see. The illusion of knowing is warm and safe, but it's also a cage. The moment you believe you've arrived, you stop moving. The moment you declare something as absolute, you blind yourself to everything it might also be. So ask yourself, what do you really know? And can you let that question hang unanswered, like a bell that never stops ringing? Because maybe it's not knowledge that brings us truth. Maybe it's the willingness to wonder. A thought arises in your mind. Maybe it's subtle, maybe it's loud. An image, a sentence, a feeling wrapped in language. You didn't summon it, not really, it just appeared. But the moment it does, your mind claims it. I thought this, but here's the paradox. What if that thought wasn't yours? This is the unsettling puzzle of the thought that isn't yours. The realization that much of what passes through your awareness may not originate from you at all, and that perhaps the boundary between your thoughts and everything else is far more porous than it seems. We live in a culture that glorifies originality, the individual, the personal voice, the I that thinks, creates, and decides. But when you slow down and observe your own mind, something strange becomes clear. Thoughts arise unannounced. You don't build them consciously. You don't engineer them like machines. They appear, fully formed, and then the mind retroactively claims ownership. Where do these thoughts come from? Some may emerge from memory, emotion, or experience. Others from unconscious patterns formed long ago. Some may be echoes of something you heard, saw, or read, but forgot. And still others might come from, well, where? That's the mystery. In many meditative traditions, it's taught that thoughts are like clouds passing through the sky of consciousness. They aren't you. They're events, occurrences, temporary phenomena. You witness them. But identifying with them is like mistaking the passing bird for the sky itself. But the modern self resists this. I think, therefore I am, Descartes wrote. The foundation of Western identity is built on the notion that thinking is proof of being. But what if the thoughts aren't yours? What then? If you are not the thinker, then what is the I that claims credit? Even science adds to the paradox. Studies in neuroscience show that decisions can be detected in the brain before we are consciously aware of them. By the time you've decided, your brain has already moved. The thought came first. The self arrived later to narrate it. So what is your thought? If someone whispers an idea in your ear while you sleep, and you wake up believing it's your own, is it any less real? If you read a sentence a decade ago and today it shows up in your writing, was that plagiarism or memory? And in the digital age, this paradox only deepens. We're bombarded with thoughts from others through screens, texts, voices, and headlines. Our internal dialogue is a collage of external inputs. Can you truly separate what's yours from what you've absorbed? But there's beauty here too. Because if a thought isn't yours, it also means you're not bound to it. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to fight it. You can let it pass without needing to identify with it. That angry thought, not yours. That fearful image, also not yours. Just a flicker in the current. This doesn't make you empty. It makes you spacious. You are not the thoughts that pass through you. You are the awareness in which they appear. You are the silence between them, the stillness that watches them arrive and leave. And from that stillness, something even more remarkable can emerge. Not thoughts that belong to you, but insights that flow through you. Inspiration that arises not from ownership, but from openness. Not from ego, but from presence. So the next time a thought arises, pause. Before you grab it, name it, defend it, or believe it. Ask yourself, is this really mine? And more importantly, do I need it to be? Because in letting go of ownership, you might discover something far greater. You were never the thinker, you were the sky. You've looked in a mirror countless times, brushed your teeth, checked your hair, adjusted your clothes, and every time you've seen a familiar face staring back. But here's a simple, disorienting truth. You've never seen your real face, not once. This is the paradox of the mirror that lies. An unsettling recognition that your most trusted reflection is an illusion, reversed and limited, and yet you've built your entire self-image upon it. Start with the obvious. A mirror flips you horizontally. Your left becomes right, your right becomes left, but your mind adjusts to this inversion so well that you don't even notice. You point to your right in the mirror, and it looks correct. Yet if someone else were to look at you, their view would be entirely different from what you've seen all your life. So whose version is real? We tend to believe the mirror because it's consistent, but it's also incomplete. It shows a flat surface, captured light, a limited angle. It shows appearance, but not presence. Image, but not experience, and yet you trust it. You shape your sense of self around it. You see tired eyes and assume you are exhausted. You see beauty and feel confident, or see a flaw and feel shame. You believe this reflection holds truth, even though it's just a trick of light on glass. But the mirror lies in more subtle ways too. It only reflects what can be seen. It doesn't reflect your inner life. It doesn't show your thoughts, your hopes, your past, or the way your energy fills a room. It doesn't capture your impact, your essence, or the way others feel when they're near you, and yet we believe it does. We stare into it and say, "That is me," but it isn't. It never was. This paradox deepens when you consider the mirrors inside your mind, the mental mirrors. The way you perceive yourself based on past experiences, cultural standards, voices from childhood, comments from others. These, too, become reflections, echoes, and over time, you begin to mistake them for reality. A teacher once said you weren't creative. A parent once made you feel small. A stranger once compared you to someone else. These words become mirrors you carry, holding distorted images that replay whenever you look inward. And just like a funhouse mirror, they warp and twist, yet you still believe them. The question is, how many of your beliefs about yourself are based on mirrors that were never accurate to begin with? The paradox is not just that the mirror lies, it's that we know it lies, and we believe it anyway. You stand before it, knowing it's reversed, knowing it's a limited surface, and still, it shapes your identity. You know your internal self is far richer, more fluid, more complex, and yet you judge yourself by what is externally reflected. But here's where the paradox becomes an invitation. If the mirror lies, then maybe you're free from what it says. Maybe your reflection is not your truth, but just one version. A visual echo, not a definition. And maybe the real you can't be seen at all, because the real you is felt. In presence. In silence. In the quiet power behind the eyes, not in how they appear, but in how they see. So next time you look into the mirror, pause. Notice the reversal. Notice the assumptions. Notice the thoughts that arise and ask, who is watching this reflection? That watcher, that awareness behind the eyes, is closer to your truth than anything you'll ever see in glass. The mirror may lie, but you are not the lie. You are the one who sees through it. There are questions that can be answered with facts. What time is it? How far is the moon? What's the capital of a country? And then, there are questions that don't seem to want an answer. You chase them in circles, only to find that every response opens more questions. Like, what is the purpose of life? What happens after death? What is consciousness? This is the paradox of the question that has no answer, the riddle that expands the more you try to solve it. We're taught to believe that every question, given enough time and intelligence, has an answer. That with the right tools we can measure anything, map everything, and understand the whole. But some questions are like black holes for the mind. They don't give answers, they give depth. Ask, what is the meaning of life? And you may arrive at religion, science, philosophy. You may hear it's love, growth, consciousness, evolution, God, or randomness. But none of these answers satisfy for long. Because underneath the question isn't a desire for data, it's a longing for understanding that transcends understanding. The paradox is this: we are meaning-seeking creatures in a universe that may not offer any. And yet, even if there is no universal answer, we continue to ask the question. And somehow, That asking gives life its richness. Like music, the beauty is not in the final note, but in the movement. The unanswered question keeps you searching, growing, evolving. If someone handed you the final answer to everything, would you be relieved or hollow? Even in science, some of the greatest breakthroughs began not with answers, but with impossible questions. What is time? What is nothingness? What existed before the universe? And even now, the most advanced minds admit, these questions may not be solvable. At least not in ways we can currently comprehend. In Zen philosophy, there are koans, questions specifically designed not to be answered. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Who were you before your parents were born? The purpose isn't to solve them, but to shatter the mind's need to solve, to awaken a deeper kind of knowing that lives beyond language. Because sometimes, the question itself is the awakening. A question with no answer acts like a mirror. It reflects back the state of the one asking it. Ask what reality is, and watch how your definition changes over time. Ask who you are, and feel how the self slips through your fingers, impossible to grasp. And yet, you keep asking. Why? Because asking keeps you alive. It keeps you soft. It keeps you in wonder. A mind full of answers closes itself off. But a mind full of questions stays open, curious, alive to the mystery of it all. The unanswered question is a flame. It keeps burning, lighting the path ahead even when there's no destination. So the next time a question haunts you, don't rush to fix it. Don't demand resolution. Instead, let it linger. Let it echo. Let it open something in you. Because sometimes, the answer is not a statement. It's a state of being. And the greatest truths aren't answers at all. They're questions you learn to live with. Imagine standing in a vast hallway with doors stretching endlessly in every direction. Behind each one lies a different version of your life. One where you made a different decision, took a different path, said yes instead of no, or never met the people who now define your world. Every choice you didn't make still exists, just not for you, or so it seems. This is the paradox of the infinite hall of choices, a place where possibility never ends, and yet you can only walk through one door at a time. Every decision you make closes 1,000 others, even small ones. What you eat, where you sit, which word you choose, fracture the future into infinite branches. At any given moment, you are surrounded by versions of reality you will never know, lives you will never live, people you will never become. And yet, this moment feels whole, complete, as if it could only be this way. How? We like to think of free will as a menu. You pick something and move on. But choice doesn't just create direction, it erases potential. For every version of you that exists, countless others vanish the moment you act. Your very identity is shaped not only by what you do, but by what you do not do. You are defined as much by the choices you abandon as those you embrace. And here's where the paradox twists. The more aware you are of your options, the heavier the weight of choosing becomes. Infinite freedom starts to feel like a prison made of possibility. Too many doors, and you freeze. One wrong step, and you spiral into regret. But is there a right door? Or do we invent meaning only after we've walked through? In some interpretations of quantum physics, like the many worlds theory, every possibility is realized. Every time you make a choice, the universe splits. One version of you says yes, another says no. Somewhere, you're still with the person you left. Somewhere, you never took that job. Somewhere, You turned left instead of right, and everything changed. But you don't get to see those versions. You live inside one thread, a hallway that always opens one door at a time. And because of that, each choice carries the ghost of what could have been. So what does that mean for free will? Are you free if every possibility exists, but only one is visible? Are you choosing your path or merely walking it? Some philosophies suggest that all choices are illusions, that everything is happening exactly as it must, that what we call decision is simply awareness catching up to fate. Others argue that choice is the most sacred thing we have, that even within limitations, the ability to direct your life gives it meaning. But maybe it's both. Maybe the paradox of choice is not about control, but about presence. You can't live in every hallway. You can't peer behind every door, but you can stand fully in the one you've chosen. You can stop mourning the lives you didn't live and bring your whole self into the one you are living. The hall is infinite. The doors are endless. But your presence, that's the one thing that brings reality into focus. So next time you face a decision, small or life-changing, don't seek perfection. Seek alignment. Seek honesty. Seek stillness long enough to hear the door that feels like yours, and then walk through. Not because it's the only door, but because it's the one that matters now. There are moments when words fail, when explanation only makes things more confusing, when the most honest response is not an argument or a story or a declaration, but a pause. A silence that fills the space so completely it seems to say everything without saying anything at all. This is the paradox of the silence that screams truth. The strange and powerful idea that in the absence of sound, meaning can grow louder than ever. We live in a world overflowing with noise. Voices compete for attention. Opinions collide. Data streams endlessly. Silence in such a world can feel like weakness, or awkwardness, or emptiness, but not all silence is the same. Some silences are hollow, others are alive. Think of the silence right after a profound realization. The moment someone you love says something that leaves you breathless. The hush before a difficult decision, or the quiet that falls after something irreversible has been done. That kind of silence doesn't feel empty, it feels full, as if reality itself has stopped to breathe. And that's where the paradox begins. Because silence, by definition, is the absence of speech. It contains no message, but sometimes it communicates more than words ever could. In ancient spiritual traditions, silence is not a void, it's a vessel. In meditation, silence is not empty, it's presence. In philosophy, the moment when words end is where the deepest truths begin. Lao Tzu wrote, "Those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know." Not because knowledge is hidden, but because truth is often beyond language. The deepest mysteries of consciousness, of death, of love, of God, resist being spoken. Try to put them into words, and you flatten them, but sit with them in silence, and they unfold. We assume that understanding requires articulation, but not all knowing can be spoken. Some things are meant to be felt, not explained, and silence becomes the only language large enough to hold them. Yet our minds resist silence. We rush to fill it, to answer, to defend, to explain. Silence makes us uncomfortable because it removes our ability to control the narrative. In silence, there is no performance, no convincing, just presence. But maybe that's where truth hides. in the space where nothing is trying to be something. Even in conversation, silence can be a form of clarity. Have you ever heard someone pause before responding, and in that pause, you learned more than if they'd spoken? Have you ever sat with someone in grief or love and realized that nothing needed to be said? Silence doesn't scream because it's loud. It screams because it's real. It cannot be argued with. It doesn't bend to interpretation. It doesn't try to be anything. And in that simplicity, it reveals something essential, something beneath all the layers of thought and language and logic. But here's the paradox's twist. The moment you try to describe that silence, it disappears. You're back in noise, back in the surface world. The truth it offered was never meant to be captured, only witnessed. So what do you do with a truth that can't be said? You live with it. You allow it. You stop trying to explain it. And in doing so, you might find that it begins to shape you in ways words never could. In a world addicted to saying more, to proving, to posting, to asserting, try saying less. Try saying nothing. And in that stillness, listen. Not for answers, but for the space between them, because sometimes the most honest thing you can say is nothing at all. Try this. Become aware of the room around you, the texture of the air, the way light lands on the wall. Now, become aware that you are aware. You are watching the room, but now you're also watching yourself watch. And just like that, you've stepped into a loop. A mind observing a mind, observing a world. This is the paradox of the mind that watches itself. Watch, a spiral of consciousness where the observer becomes the observed, and the line between subject and object begins to dissolve. We often think of the mind as a single, stable entity, a thinker, a controller, a central you behind the eyes, pulling the strings. But when you start to pay close attention, something strange happens. You realize that your thoughts are being watched. You notice that your emotions are being felt by something deeper, something quieter. And the moment you recognize that, another layer appears. Who's doing the noticing? If you're aware of a thought, then clearly you are not that thought. If you can observe a feeling of sadness or joy, then you are not that feeling either. You are the witness of it. But if you are the witness, what watches the witness? As you keep peeling back, you find that each eye you point to is being seen by another. A chain of observers, each watching the last. But where does it end? Does it end, or is consciousness a mirror reflecting into itself endlessly? This is not just philosophical play. It's an experience many encounter during deep meditation, introspection, or altered states of awareness. A sense of self that detaches, then detaches again, until you're left with a kind of pure witnessing, a formless presence watching everything, including itself. But that raises a haunting question. If the observer can be observed, is there any stable self at all? What we call I may not be a single thing, but a shifting point of view. A frame within a frame within a frame. Like a hall of mirrors, each reflection feels real until you look closer and see it's just bouncing light. The paradox is that the mind, in trying to find its own source, creates more of itself. Like a hand trying to grasp itself, it loops endlessly, never quite touching what it's looking for. And yet, in that very loop, something profound is revealed. Awareness doesn't need to arrive somewhere. Its power is in its capacity to witness itself, to become intimate with its own unfolding, to see thought as thought, feeling as feeling, moment as moment, without fusing with any of it. This is why some traditions say, you are not the body, You are not the mind. You are not even the watcher. You are that which knows watching exists. That's a riddle on its own. But maybe the goal isn't to solve the riddle. Maybe the goal is to experience the loop and not get lost in it, because there's beauty in this infinite gaze. In the mind, watching the mind. In the presence, watching presence. It means you're not stuck in one identity. You're fluid, expansive, capable of shifting perspectives endlessly. And in those quiet moments where you see yourself seeing and feel yourself feeling, you touch something beyond words, a stillness, a depth, a space where the self fades and what remains is simply awareness itself. So the next time you catch yourself thinking, pause, watch the thought, then notice the one watching, then the one noticing that noticing, and in that infinite loop, smile. Because you are not just the mind, you are the mystery watching it unfold. Imagine someone walking through every corner of the world, across mountains, oceans, cities, and deserts. They've traveled far and wide, collected memories, changed with every step. But here's the twist. They've never actually moved. Not an inch. The scenery changed, the stories unfolded. But the traveler, always still. This is the paradox of the traveler who stays still. The realization that while everything in your life appears to move and evolve, the awareness at the center of it all never truly goes anywhere. At first, this seems ridiculous. Of course we move. We walk, grow, age, change jobs, meet people, chase dreams. Our lives are full of transitions. Childhood to adulthood, home to home, love to loss. Each step marks a moment in time. But pause. Close your eyes. Notice the part of you that's watching these thoughts. The you that was there when you were a child. The one who saw your first memory, your biggest heartbreak, your happiest day. Has that awareness aged? Did it travel? Or has it always been in the same place, witnessing? That's where the paradox begins. Because while the body changes, while thoughts and emotions rise and fall, the observer behind it all remains strangely still, not frozen in time, but untouched by it. No matter where you go, what you do, what you become, you are always right here, looking out through the same window of consciousness. The external journey unfolds, but the internal witness doesn't walk. It watches. And this isn't just poetic mysticism. In neuroscience, the idea of a unified constant self is being questioned. Memory, emotion, identity, all are shown to be fluid, scattered, reconstructed. Yet something persists. A thread of continuity, even when every part of you has changed. What is that thread? Some traditions call it the soul. Others call it pure awareness, or the self with a capital S. Not the personality, not the ego, but the silent center behind all experiences. And from this center, you can travel the entire world without ever leaving your seat. So why does this matter? Because we often chase change as if it's out there. We think transformation comes from motion. I need to move on. I need a new place, a new job, a new life. And yes, externals can catalyze growth. But what if the most profound movement isn't about getting somewhere, but about becoming still enough to notice you've always been home? The paradox invites you to reconsider what it means to journey. Maybe it's not about distance, but depth. Not about reaching, but returning. Returning to the still point inside you that never moved, even as everything else did. This doesn't mean your experiences aren't real. They are. The pain, the joy, the love, the loss, They leave imprints. They shape the personality, but not the watcher. The traveler remains untouched, still, silent, present. And when you realize that, something remarkable happens. You can stop running. You can stop seeking arrival in places that were never meant to hold you, because you were never lost. You only forgot where you were standing. So the next time you feel stuck or restless or like you haven't gone far enough, pause. Close your eyes. Return to that stillness behind the motion and remember, you are the traveler and you are already home. There's a moment just before you speak, a fragile, electric instant, when a truth exists in perfect clarity inside you. It feels whole, wordless, alive. But the moment you open your mouth to express it, something slips. The words fall short. The meaning feels diluted. You try again, more words, different ones, but it only grows more distant. This is the paradox of the truth that disappears when spoken. The experience that some truths become less true the moment you try to express them. Language is miraculous. It allows us to share thoughts, build bridges, explain the stars. But it's also a limitation. Every word is a container, and truth, especially the deep, personal kind, often refuses to be contained. We speak in metaphors, analogies, symbols. We say, "I'm overwhelmed." But what we really mean is 1,000-layered emotions, memories, sensations that no sentence could hold. And yet, we try, because truth demands to be shared. But with each attempt, we realize words are shadows. They point to something real, but they are not the thing itself. You can describe a fire, but the words will never burn your skin. You can talk about love, but the syllables won't make your heart race. You can define peace, but the definition won't quiet your mind. So why do we feel that urge to speak at all? Perhaps it's not to transmit truth, but to reach, to gesture towards something we both feel, hoping the other person will meet us in the space between the words, a kind of shared silence dressed in sound. This paradox is especially common in spiritual experiences, grief, awe, and moments of profound insight. Try to explain what it's like to truly forgive someone, or to lose yourself in nature, or to feel the presence of something greater than yourself. Whatever you say, it always sounds less. Even mystics across cultures have encountered this wall. In Zen, it's said that enlightenment can't be spoken. In Taoism, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching reads, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao." Truth, once spoken, is no longer the whole truth. But here's the twist. This isn't a failure. It's not a flaw in language. It's a feature of being human. Because perhaps the deepest truths aren't meant to be communicated. They're meant to be experienced. A child doesn't need to define wonder to feel it. A moment of silence between two people can carry more honesty than an hour of talking. A tear, a pause, a breath. These often carry truths that words only circle around. So what do we do with this paradox? Do we stop trying to speak? Not at all. We speak not to capture the truth, but to dance with it, to chase it around the edges of meaning, to offer our reflections knowing they are incomplete, and to listen for reflections in return. The beauty lies not in perfect accuracy, but in the attempt, the reaching, the vulnerability of trying to give voice to something unspeakable. And sometimes, if we're lucky, the truth doesn't disappear completely. It just hides in the silence between the words. In the space where understanding happens, even when nothing is said. So next time you struggle to say what you feel, Don't fight it. Let your words be imperfect. Let your truth shimmer behind them, untouched. Speak, not to be exact, but to be real. Because the real truth may not live in language, but it lives in you, and it doesn't need to be spoken to be known. We crave solidity, a world we can touch, measure, define. Reality, we believe, is what's out there, concrete, stable, separate from our perception. But the deeper we look, the more that world begins to vanish. The more we try to pin it down, the more it dissolves. This is the paradox of the reality that refuses to exist. The haunting realization that reality itself may be an illusion that collapses the moment we try to observe it. Physics opened the door to this mystery. At the quantum level, particles do not exist in fixed positions until they are observed. They hover in probabilities, in clouds of possibility, existing as maybe until the moment of measurement forces them into is. And even then, what exactly are we seeing? What we call matter is mostly empty space. Atoms are made of particles so tiny and so strange they defy every classical rule we've created. Electrons don't spin around nuclei like miniature planets. They appear and disappear, acting like waves, like particles, like neither, like both. Even space and time, our most basic coordinates of existence, begin to warp. Time slows with speed. Space bends with gravity. The closer we look, the less stable it all becomes. The world we thought was made of solid building blocks is instead made of questions, unanswered, maybe unanswerable. And yet, we live as though reality is obvious. We drink coffee, pay bills, fall in love, argue over facts. But what are we arguing over exactly? What is this reality we claim to know so well? Perception. It's filtered, colored by memory, mood, belief. Two people can witness the same event and recall it entirely differently. So is reality just consensus? Agreement among minds built from the same flawed machinery? And what happens when that agreement breaks? In dreams, your mind generates a world that feels utterly real until you wake up. Who's to say this isn't another dream, one you haven't yet awakened from? Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. Descartes doubted everything but the fact that he was doubting. Berkeley claimed that existence itself depends on being perceived. And in the East, Advaita Vedanta teaches that the material world is Maya, illusion appearing, real but lacking independent substance. But if reality is illusion, what is behind it? If nothing we perceive is truly there, then what is doing the perceiving? This is where the paradox tightens. Because even as reality slips through our fingers, something remains. The experience of slipping. Something is aware. Something watches the collapse. Something stands behind the curtain of perception, quietly observing the stage as it folds into itself. That something is you, not the personal you, with your name and history and preferences, but the deeper you, the awareness that persists, even when everything else dissolves. So maybe reality doesn't exist as something. Maybe it exists as experience, not a thing out there, but a flowing dance between consciousness and perception. A play with no fixed stage, only actors appearing, disappearing, shifting in the light of awareness. And this realization doesn't mean the world is meaningless. On the contrary, it becomes more sacred, more fluid, more alive. Because if reality isn't fixed, then every moment is an act of creation. Every breath is a new canvas. Every experience, a ripple in a field of infinite possibility. So the next time you feel certain, pause. Ask yourself, what am I actually experiencing? Is it the world, or is it the mind constructing a world in this moment? And if it's the latter, is that any less real? Maybe reality isn't something that exists. Maybe it's something that happens right here, right now. And maybe that's enough. To be seen, truly seen, is one of the deepest longings of the human heart. We want to be understood, recognized, felt. We want someone to look past the surface and see the truth beneath. But the more we try to be seen, the more we often feel invisible. And when someone does look closely, we begin to change, to shift, to hide, to perform. This is the paradox of being seen, that the very act of being observed alters who we are, and yet we still long for that observation to reveal something authentic. It starts subtly. You're alone, and you act one way. Someone walks in, and suddenly a shift happens. You become aware of yourself. You adjust. You monitor. You begin, consciously or unconsciously, to present a version of you that is watchable. In psychology, this is called the observer effect, not unlike in quantum physics. When something is watched, it changes. A particle behaves differently under observation. So do we. So then, what is the real self? Is it who you are when no one is looking? Or is it who you become in the presence of others? The paradox deepens when we consider how much of our identity is built through mirrors, through feedback, reactions, and reflection from other people. A smile tells you you're likable. A frown tells you you've crossed a line. We build a sense of self from 1,000 tiny reflections, but none of them are truly you. They are fragments, interpretations, echoes distorted by the minds that see you. And yet we rely on them. Without mirrors, how do we know who we are? But if those mirrors are always distorted, how can we ever trust them? So we begin to perform. We wear masks, one for friends, one for family, one for strangers, one even for ourselves. We shift tones, hide parts, exaggerate others. And over time, we forget which face was the original. But was there ever an original? Or are we all fluid beings, constantly reshaping under the gaze of the world? Here's where the paradox cuts deep. Being seen is essential, but it's never complete. No one can fully see your internal world, not your pain, not your dreams, not the private layers that make you, you. And yet, being seen, even incompletely, can still feel like coming home. Maybe it's not about being fully seen, but about being accepted anyway, even in fragments, to be seen imperfectly and still be held. And what of the gaze you cast upon yourself? You look in the mirror, you judge, you compare, you remember things others said, you carry their voices inside your own. But are you really seeing yourself? Or just the reflection of every moment you try to be seen? True sight might not come from the outside at all. It may come from stillness, from presence, from the quiet inner awareness that watches you without judgment, without filters, without demand. That presence sees everything, your contradictions, your shadows, your masks, and holds them in silence. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. So, the next time you feel unseen, ask, am I showing something real? And the next time you feel exposed, ask, who is watching me? And do they truly see? Because the truth is, being seen will always change you. But being known, even just for a moment, is worth the paradox. Because sometimes, in the reflection of another's eyes, you glimpse the parts of yourself you forgot were still there. Imagine a book where the final chapter explains how the first chapter came to be, a story whose ending writes its own origin. Now stretch that image beyond fiction. What if reality itself works the same way? What if the effect creates the cause, the destination gives birth to the journey? This is the paradox of the loop that creates its beginning, a mind-bending twist on cause and effect, where the sequence of time folds back on itself, and the start of something is created by its own end. We tend to think in straight lines. First this, then that. Cause leads to effect. Action leads to consequence. This is how we understand time, responsibility, even morality. But in the strange corners of thought, philosophy, physics, and metaphysics, this tidy line begins to curve. Take time travel, for instance. The classic paradox. Someone goes back in time and hands Shakespeare a copy of Hamlet. Shakespeare copies it word for word and publishes it as his own. Centuries later, that same book is brought back in time by another traveler. The question is, who wrote Hamlet? The traveler got it from Shakespeare. Shakespeare got it from the traveler. The story exists in a loop with no clear beginning. This is known as a causal loop, a chain of events in which an event is among the causes of another event, which is in turn among the causes of the first. It breaks our sense of origin, of authorship, of time. But what if this isn't just a science fiction scenario? Look at your own life. Have you ever made a decision that, in hindsight, feels like it always had to happen? As if your future self reached back and nudged your past towards something inevitable. Some call it intuition. Others call it fate. But the sensation is eerily familiar. A loop disguised as a line. Even in creativity, this paradox appears. A musician writes a melody, but swears it didn't come from them. It was as if it already existed, and they simply uncovered it. Artists speak of visions that feel remembered rather than invented, ideas that emerge fully formed, demanding to be brought into the world, as if they were always waiting for someone to pick them up. The loop deepens when we explore consciousness itself. Some spiritual philosophies suggest that the universe awakens to itself through us. That human awareness is not a byproduct of the cosmos, but its very purpose, that we are the destination toward which evolution has always been heading. And yet we are also the ones asking why it all began. If that's true, then we are the loop, the end that creates the beginning, the question that gives birth to itself. This doesn't mean time isn't real, but it may not be what we think it is. It may not flow like a river, but pulse like a circle. In quantum physics, some interpretations suggest that events can be entangled across time, that the present can influence the past, just as the past shapes the future. And in our own inner experience, time is already strange. A single moment can stretch forever. A year can vanish in memory. Your future self can haunt you like a ghost, whispering regrets before they're even real. So what do we do with this? We stop asking, where did it begin? And start asking, what if beginning and end are illusions? What if every step you've taken was also a step returning to something you already are? What if your future is quietly rewriting your past? And what if you are the author of your own story? Not because you wrote the first word, but because you're writing the last. The loop cannot be escaped, but it can be seen. And in that moment of recognition, when you realize the path behind you was made by the steps you're taking now, something profound happens. You stop chasing origins and start living from the center of the loop. Freedom is often seen as the ultimate ideal, the ability to choose, to move, to speak, to live without restriction. It is painted as the path to happiness, the key to fulfillment. But what happens when freedom becomes absolute? When there are no boundaries, no guidance, no limitations of any kind? This is the paradox of the prison of absolute freedom, the unsettling idea that when every door is open, you might find yourself unable to walk through any of them. At first glance, unlimited freedom sounds like a dream. Who wouldn't want to do whatever they want, whenever they want, without consequence? But there's a hidden burden buried inside it. When everything is possible, nothing feels necessary. When every path is available, none feel meaningful. Freedom, taken to its furthest extreme, becomes paralyzing. This is known in psychology as the paradox of choice. Studies have shown that when people are presented with too many options, they struggle to choose at all. And even when they do, they're less satisfied. Why? Because with every chosen path, countless others are lost, and the mind begins to wonder, did I choose wrong? But the real weight of absolute freedom is not in making a decision. It's in having to invent the reason for every decision yourself. With no rules, no structure, no external compass, you must define what matters. What is good? What is worth doing? And that can feel like a prison of its own, because we often think we want freedom, when what we really want is meaning. And meaning doesn't grow in limitless space. It grows in context, in contrast, in challenge. The wall that blocks you gives shape to your movement. The rules you resist give weight to your rebellion. The limitation gives birth to the art. Take language. Without grammar, structure, and limits, words dissolve into noise. Take music. Without rhythm and key, sound loses its power. Take love. Without commitment, some form of boundary, it becomes a fleeting feeling rather than a shared journey. So in chasing absolute freedom, we risk losing the very thing that gives life texture, the ability to care deeply about one path, one moment, one choice. And here's the deeper twist. True freedom might not be the removal of all boundaries, but the conscious embrace of the right ones. A monk living by vows is not less free. He may, in fact, feel more liberated than someone with no structure. An artist with constraints often creates more profoundly than one with unlimited tools. A person in love may willingly give up other options, not as a loss, but as an act of deeper commitment. Because freedom without direction is emptiness. But freedom chosen within limits becomes power. This doesn't mean surrendering control. It means recognizing that freedom finds its meaning not in its size, but in its focus. So what do we do with this paradox? We stop imagining freedom as the absence of limits. We begin seeing it as the presence of intentional ones. You don't need to be able to do everything. You just need to choose something with your whole heart. And in doing so, you may find that you're not less free. You're finally free enough. Enough to act. Enough to love. Enough to be. Because when everything is possible, the most powerful thing you can do is decide what matters. We search for answers. From childhood to old age, our minds crave the certainty of resolution. Why are we here? What is the right path? What is the truth? Beneath every question lies a quiet hope that somewhere there is a final answer that will make everything fall into place. But what if that answer doesn't exist? This is the paradox of the illusion of the final answer, the haunting idea that our deepest questions may not have solutions, only deeper questions dressed in the clothes of certainty. There's something seductive about believing in an ultimate answer, a single idea, belief, or discovery that unlocks the full meaning of life. Religions offer it. Philosophies attempt it. Even science at times seems to chase it. The theory of everything, the formula that explains the universe. But each time we think we've found it, something unexpected happens. The answer creates more questions. Newton's laws explained the movement of the heavens until relativity rewrote space and time. Einstein's equations brought clarity until quantum mechanics shattered certainty into probability. Every time we reach a final layer of truth, we discover it was just a flaw resting on deeper unknowns. And yet we continue to search. Why? Because the desire for a final answer is not just intellectual, it's emotional. We want closure. We want the storm of uncertainty to calm. We want to believe that something, somewhere, makes perfect sense. But here's where the paradox sharpens. The closer we come to what feels like an absolute truth, the more rigid we often become. We stop exploring. We stop listening. The answer becomes a wall instead of a window. And slowly, the truth we once cherished turns into a prison. It's not that answers are bad. They're necessary. They help us navigate. But the illusion lies in thinking that any answer is final. Because truth, like life, moves. It evolves, shifts, adapts. What is true today may not be true tomorrow. What feels right now may feel hollow later. And what we call final is often just what we've stopped questioning. So what if the final answer is this? There is no final answer. Not because the world is meaningless, but because it's too vast, too mysterious, too alive to be reduced to a single conclusion. The universe is not a riddle to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And in that mystery, something beautiful happens. We learn to trade certainty for curiosity. We stop clinging to absolutes and start dancing with the unknown. We begin to see that every answer is a stepping stone, not a destination. Even within ourselves, we carry this paradox. We believe we know who we are until something breaks and that identity shatters. We think we understand love until it changes. We think we've healed until an old wound reopens. The self, like the world, refuses to be pinned down. And maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's freedom. Because when you give up the illusion of the final answer, you give yourself permission to keep growing, to keep wondering, to hold ideas lightly, to live in the question. So the next time you feel the ache for certainty, the urge to find the answer that ends the search, pause and ask, what if the search is the point? What if the beauty lies not in solving the mystery, but in being part of it? Who are you? It seems like a simple question. You might answer with your name, your job, your passions. You might point to your body, your memories, your beliefs. But peel those away, layer by layer, and something strange begins to happen. The more you look for the self, the more it seems to slip away. This is the paradox of the self that cannot be found. The realization that the you believe in may be nothing more than a story, constantly shifting, never fully graspable. From a young age, we are taught to build an identity. We learn to say I and fill that word with roles: student, sibling, citizen, thinker. We stitch together an internal narrative of who we are, who we've been, and who we're becoming. And it works. It keeps us grounded, helps us make decisions, allows us to function in the world. But what happens when we try to find the I beneath all of it? Close your eyes and search within. Where is the self located? Is it in your thoughts, your body, your sensations? One by one, each can be observed. Your thoughts are like clouds passing through the sky of your awareness. Your emotions shift, your body changes, but the observer, the one watching, remains unseen. In neuroscience, the self is often described as a construct, a narrative generated by various modules of the brain to create a coherent sense of agency. But when studied closely, no single center of self has been found. Just processes, circuits, firing neurons, experience without a fixed experiencer. In spiritual traditions, this paradox has been echoed for millennia. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta, no self, teaches that the self is an illusion, not non-existent, but empty of inherent identity. Like a whirlpool in a river, it has form and movement, but no separate substance. And yet, we feel so strongly that there is a me inside, a central figure behind the eyes. But what if that feeling is just another part of the illusion? What if the self is not something you are, but something you do, a verb, not a noun? What if it's an ongoing performance, a pattern of thought and memory that persists only through repetition? This doesn't mean you're not real. It means you're more fluid than you think. You are not the name on your ID. You are not the opinions you held 5 years ago. You are not even the thoughts you're having right now. Because all of those things change, and yet you're here, aware, present, watching. And that awareness, it has no form, no identity, no past or future. It just is. So what happens when you stop trying to find the self and instead rest in the awareness that watches everything come and go? You might discover a deeper peace, a freedom from the need to define, control, or defend who you are. You realize that the fear of being nobody was actually the gateway to being everything. You are not the mask. You are not the actor. You are the space in which the play unfolds. So the next time you say, I, pause. Ask yourself, who is speaking? Who is thinking that thought? And when you can't find an answer, when the seeker dissolves into silence, smile. Because you've just touched the paradox, and in that moment, you were more yourself than ever. Before the stars, before atoms, before time itself, there was nothing. No form, no sound, no direction, just silence. And from that silence, something stirred. Not an explosion, not a command, but perhaps a question. This is the paradox of the question that created the universe. The possibility that existence itself began not with an answer, but with the very act of wondering. Science speaks of the Big Bang, a singular moment when space and time unfolded from a point of infinite density. But what caused that point to ignite? What lay before? Ask any physicist, and you'll find the same mystery mirrored in mathematics. Time itself began at that moment, so there was no before to speak of. But still, the mind asks, why anything at all? Why not eternal nothingness? This question haunts not just science, but philosophy and spirituality. And here's the paradox. It may be that this question didn't emerge after the universe, but that it somehow preceded it. That the act of questioning itself was the spark that birthed creation. Because to ask a question is to separate, to create distinction. It is to divide the known from the unknown. In that sense, a question marks the birth of duality, subject and object, light and dark, being and non-being. Perhaps the first ripple in the void wasn't a bang, but a flicker of inquiry, a conscious curiosity echoing through emptiness. And yet, if a question existed before the universe, who asked it? Was it God? Energy? An unborn awareness floating beyond time? Or was the universe itself the question, the unfolding inquiry that now looks back at its own origin through billions of curious eyes. Think about it. We are the product of cosmic evolution, and yet we turn around and ask, what created us? It's almost as if the universe evolved a nervous system capable of asking itself why it exists. In that way, we are the questioners, but we are also the question. And maybe the answer can never be spoken because it was never meant to be. Maybe the answer is the universe itself, its expansion, its chaos, its symmetry, its silence. Maybe existence is not something to be solved, but something to be lived, moment by moment, breath by breath. This idea shows up in mystical traditions across time. In the Kabbalah, creation begins with a divine withdrawal, a space carved into a nothingness so that something can become. In Eastern philosophies, the universe is not made, it is dreamed, not as a conclusion, but as a question unfolding endlessly. And what if the question is still being asked? What if every moment is part of the asking? Every galaxy a phrase, every human life a word, every moment of wonder a punctuation mark in an eternal sentence that will never end. This is not the kind of paradox you solve. It's the kind that humbles you because it reminds you that not everything needs an answer. Sometimes it is enough to sit in awe of the question itself. So the next time you stare into the sky or feel that ache in your chest for something more, don't rush to resolve it. Don't drown it in explanations. Let it ache. Let it stretch you. Let it whisper the same thing it whispered at the dawn of time. Why? And in that question, remember, you are not just part of the universe. You are the part that wonders why it began. We've walked through questions that bend reality, paradoxes that unravel logic, and mysteries that defy all answers. And yet, through every contradiction and every silence, one truth persists. The unknown isn't something to be feared. It's something to be felt. It's where imagination lives, where awe begins, and where the mind remembers its own depth. Each paradox was not a dead end, but a doorway. A gentle invitation to loosen your grip on certainty and embrace the vastness of what cannot be named. Because the more you explore these impossibilities, the more you begin to see life isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be experienced, witnessed, and questioned endlessly. So, as you drift into sleep or stillness, let the unresolved questions echo softly within you. Not as problems to fix, but as companions on the journey. You don't need to chase every answer. Sometimes it's enough to simply ask, and if you found even one paradox tonight that made you pause, then something inside you shifted. That's where the real magic lives. Let it unfold. Let it deepen. And if you're drawn to walk this path further, full of wonder, silence, and thought, don't forget to subscribe and share this journey with others who seek what can't be spoken. There's more waiting just beyond the next question.